Welcome to Sproutcast, where we speak with changemakers, social innovators, and entrepreneurs about how to make the world a better place. And now, here's your host, Julia Duffy.
Welcome back to Sproutcast. My name is Julia Duffy, and today we're speaking with Aaron Hurst. Aaron Hurst is a globally recognised entrepreneur who works to create communities that are empowered to realise their potential. Aaron co-founded Imperative, a technology platform that enables people to discover and connect and act on what gives them purpose in their work. He's also the founder of the Taproot Foundation and the author of the 2014 book, The Purpose Economy. Aaron is speaking with us today from the US. Welcome to Sproutcast, Aaron.
That's great to be here with you.
Wonderful. So I thought I'd start by asking you what your history of involvement with the NFP space has been, and I guess where it originated from. Was there something that started you off on this path, and why were you interested in becoming involved?
And you have 4 hours, is that right? It's a long conversation.
I'd like to hear the whole story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of a hard question to answer. I mean, part of it's family. One side of my family had a lot of family members who were involved in healthcare, which in the United States is the nonprofit sector plays a very big role in. And on the other side were social entrepreneurs. My grandfather developed the blueprint for the Peace Corps, which was a signature program of President Kennedy's here in the U.S., and that was a major part of sort of my family's legacy. And he ran an organization called the Aspen Institute, which is one of the big nonprofit think tanks in the U.S. So I was really raised knowing the nonprofit sector more so than corporate sector. And my parents, both worked. My mom was a small business entrepreneur, but my dad worked in higher education at universities that were also nonprofits. So I really grew up with that as probably a more comfortable place to operate than in government or in private sector. I actually started my own business, my first business when I was 16. But once I got to university, started creating social entrepreneurship programs. So create a whole program for teaching in prisons. We taught creative writing in local prisons. When I graduated from college, moved to Chicago in the center of the U.S. and worked on inner city education, working at curriculum design and teacher funding. I, at that point, really got frustrated because I found the nonprofit sector had all the right motivation and were working on the right things, but weren't scaling to make the difference they needed to. So quit my job in the nonprofit sector and went and got a job in Silicon Valley back in 97, and worked for two different startups that both had strong social missions as part of what they were doing, but were very much for-profit, and saw them scale from, in both cases, I was one of the first employees to over 200 people in 2 years, and really came to understand what it is that separated these startups from the nonprofits I'd worked with. And part of it was capital, financial capital, but a big part of it was they had access to the marketing, tech, HR, finance, strategy, and other functional skills that nonprofits rarely invest in, and realized that there was a significant opportunity for us to create a marketplace for business professionals to donate their professional talents to help nonprofits meet these needs so they could better scale and be effective. And that was really the catalyst for creating the Taproot Foundation, which was a nonprofit organization I started back in 2001 with the goal of ensuring nonprofits have access to those resources, and really catalyzed a movement in the U.S., which by the time I left was about a $15 billion a year marketplace for pro bono services, and got to work with also agencies all around the world doing pro bono and working with these most amazing professionals from both the for-profit and nonprofit sector. I ultimately left a couple years ago to start Imperative, which we actually started as a for-benefit corp. So it's a corporation, a business, but it has a classification of being first and foremost about social benefit. And I'm finding this sort of hybrid model to be really, really a great fit for me. Along the way, I've been a part of a lot of different nonprofit coalitions. I've served on boards, most notably on the board of BoardSource, which is sort of the leading U.S. nonprofit focused on governance and best practices and training in governance. So it's been a long and sordid history.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. And so has your understanding of, or I guess it sounds like your understanding of the NFP space and where you fit into it has changed over the years. Has that kind of led to the thesis of your book, The Purpose Economy? Is that been kind of based, or is the background in your journey through the NFP space?
In part, I think the Purpose Economy, my book, was inspired to largely by my uncle's work when he was an economist at Stanford and coined the term information economy and proved that we'd entered into the third economy in history, having gone from an agrarian to an industrial to then an information economy. And what I saw at Taproot as I was working with nonprofits and business and government was that similar to what he saw when the information economy was emerging, we were seeing major changes happening in the fundamental priorities of people around what they were spending money on, what they were spending their time on, and how they were assessing their careers. And that this was leading to another major transformation, and I believe the fourth transformation of our economy in our history, where purpose and the need for meaningful relationships, making an impact, and growing is actually turning into a massive economic force.
And so is that something that you see is not just shaping the traditional marketplace, but shaping the way that nonprofits are operating or are having to operate as well?
To some degree. I think it's doing a couple of different things. And I speak from some global experience, but it's pretty US centric, which is I think it's creating a proliferation of people starting nonprofits, for one, a proliferation in philanthropy, but it's also creating a lot of competition for nonprofits in that there's a lot more social benefit corporations that are emerging. And more corporations are taking on sort of social benefit as a core part of their messaging. So the sort of nonprofit monopoly on messages of cause and of impact is eroding. I think we're also finding, from an employment standpoint, that people are seeing that there are a lot of different ways to get meaning and purpose at work, and it doesn't require working in the nonprofit sectors. You're seeing a lot of people who talk in universities about wanting to make an impact actually then going into companies because they realize they can do that there, and in many cases better. So it's a pretty big shift there.
I'm interested in what you're saying just now about individuals contributing in the kind of making a difference or for purpose side of things in corporations and not in the traditional realm that we'd think of as being for purpose. Could you talk a little bit more on that and how perhaps someone who's in that position could go about contributing in that way?
Yeah, it's almost infinite. I think you think about how you can contribute. First and foremost, no matter what kind of organization you're in, I think most important form of contribution is to your coworkers. When I've done work with doctors, for example, they often speak about their relationship with their coworkers as even being more important than their patients. So the ability to really focus in on building a community, being able to support each other, regardless of what the mission of the organization is huge. I think secondly, companies often sit on vast resources and have incredible ability to influence public policy, what people buy, how things are made, et cetera. So in many cases, if you want to make a really large impact, being able to do that on the platform of a large company is much easier than at a four-person nonprofit. So a lot of people are seeing that. And then you're seeing more companies that in and of themselves are doing proactive products and services that are about improving people's lives, addressing environmental needs, et cetera. So this line is just incredibly blurry. And I would go even further. I'm finding the distinction to be less and less meaningful. I'm finding a lot of people working in the nonprofit sector that have very little purpose in their work, and finding people in the for-profit sector who have tremendous purpose. Also seeing, a lot of people who are working in small business and family-owned businesses that are as passionate and as engaged as the best nonprofits. So it's really blurring.
And is this connected, or is you mentioned earlier that the Taproot Foundation is connected to, or purpose is resourcing NFPs and encouraging pro bono, I guess. Is that correct? Is that another way that you're finding corporations or for-profit organizations contributing more and people being able to find purpose through that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more at an individual level you're seeing that movement. It's certainly happening at a corporate level. The thing we're seeing, especially with the millennial generation, but it's also happening with boomers and everyone, is fundamentally a move from a single monolithic career to seeing their work as a portfolio of projects. And some of them are within their employer and some of them are outside. And a lot of people are supplementing their work with pro bono work where they're needing to have more direct connection to the community, to feel a greater sense of purpose. So it's really part of that sort of a portfolio approach to work. And being able to see yourself as more than a one-trick pony.
So is pro bono, in the way you're thinking about it, more something that someone would do individually and not organised through where they work? Or it's something I think that we don't do as much here in Australia. So I'm interested to find out more how it works over there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at pro bono in the US, the vast majority of it's just people done on an individual basis where I'm on a board, I need help with a new logo for my nonprofit. I have a friend who happens to be a designer, and I just ask him, would you be willing to do this for me, right? It's that sort of casual, socially networked ask. That's by far the most common. You see professional services firms, so the organizations that are in the business of providing consulting services end up doing a lot of pro bono because that's what their product is. So the donation of it is a natural extension. And then the sort of small minority, but important component as well is like a company that isn't in the business of consulting that says, hey, we've got all this amazing talent. They've been going out and volunteering, but that's not really a great use of their time. Why don't we have them actually do what they're great at and give what they know? And they start to build programs. And the majority of Taproot's revenue, and I would argue their impact, has been in building these programs for companies because the companies don't have the infrastructure to know how to do consulting work, much less pro bono work. So helping them vet NFPs, helping them scope projects, helping them manage projects, helping them evaluate projects. You find like a wide range of needs. And Taproot is able to provide those consulting services.
And so I guess that's from the perspective of the people offering the pro bono services. How much are you involved in the NFP side of organisations seeking pro bono? Could you speak on perhaps how someone running a small organisation or a new organisation would go about seeking these services?
Sure. No, we've studied that a ton at Taproot. And I think there's sort of a couple different key decisions. The most important one, though, is are you looking for like a one-off need, or is this something where you want to build into your strategy sort of an ongoing supply of pro bono services, right? So if it's just a one-time thing, I think it's just a question of figuring out who's in your social network, figuring out who has access. And we've got a book called Powered by Pro Bono that Taproot put out that really goes step by step through that process so you can do it. But to me, that's not nearly as strategic as saying, hey, I actually think that going forward, and this is in the US what we found the most successful NFPs do is they say we want 20% of our budget to be pro bono. And that requires more systemically thinking about how you structure the organization. And it really begins with your board of directors and having your board intentionally recruited to not just be raising money, but actually have a role in bringing in pro bono resources from their organizations and their social networks. So it's being able to say, you know what, we need a senior marketing person on our board, and part of their job explicitly is to help secure the marketing pro bono resources we need, and really building that into the board's function.
So I might step back a bit and ask you how you came about founding the Taproot Foundation. Where did the idea come from, and how did you know that you wanted to build something out of it?
Yeah, it came very much out of that experience of having worked in Chicago and seeing those nonprofits struggling, and then going to Silicon Valley and having that insight about what was needed. What occurred to me was just that the people I had built relationships with in the business world were hungry to give back, but they didn't want to do traditional volunteer work. They wanted to do something more strategic that made a better use of their time. And, it started off at first with just a pilot of saying, I wonder if I asked my colleagues, would they be willing to do this? What would they say? And without an exception, they were all like, awesome, sign me up. And then I had the harder problem, which is I went out to nonprofits and said, hey, we got a bunch of folks here that want to help you build a website, do branding. And almost without exception, they all said, no, thank you. So it was the exact opposite of what I thought would happen. I thought the professionals might say no, and the nonprofits would be like clamoring. And it's because they've been burned so many times by good intentions that just didn't produce results. So the first 3 years at Taproot, our focus was solely on how do we make pro bono a reliable process so that if we award a project to a nonprofit, like we guarantee the results and we can really make sure it gets done. And it took us, 3+ years to really work out the science of pro bono to the point where we could have a 95% plus completion rate. And that was really the focus up front, just proof of concept, proof that we could actually make something that people saw the potential in, but that was broken, and make it work. And that alone really sparked the whole movement because it took a great idea, that had been had many times before, but made it viable. So that was sort of one part of the story. I think the other part was, I think the funding side, which is the inevitable part of any founding story, which was, I quit my job, basically did Taproot for about 18 months on my credit card. It was my only income, was debt, selling my car, basically liquidating everything I owned to prove that this was possible. Because I was just so dead set on proving it. It was like a stubborn mental illness. Eventually was lucky enough to be introduced to the Draper Richards Foundation, which had just started a couple months earlier, which funds early stage social entrepreneurs. And it was really at the time like a new concept. And it started by one of the top venture capitalists in the world. And he was trying to apply the same kind of thinking and best practices of venture capital to nonprofits. And given my business background, it was like a really great fit. So they were able to fund my salary at least, plus an assistant for 3 years, which really enabled us to take it to the next level. But it's, I really strongly believe, and I think the research backs it up, that entrepreneurship is highly correlated with mental health issues. It's not something generally that sane people do. And when people say they want to become an entrepreneur, how should they do it? I'm like, I wouldn't wish that on somebody else. Mm-hmm. You have to be very divorced from reality to be able to do it.
Okay. It's interesting. Were there any other kind of, apart from this grant, resources that you called on in starting up the organization, or ones that you now know about that you kind of wish you had access to or known about at the time?
Yeah, most of it, I was lucky enough that early in my life, became aware, although I didn't know what the label of it was, that I had a strong learning disability in being ADHD. And as a result, I've always had to seek help from other people to be successful. And it was incredibly helpful to me. And I think it was key to Taproot's whole model was I just think every person I come across, I think of as someone who can help and who gets value from helping, and that I'm not putting a burden on them, but it's a gift. And I don't just spin it that way. It's a very sincere belief. And I think in terms of resources, I just believe the people that are already in our lives, everyone's looking for things to do that are more meaningful, that they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And you need to activate that to get them involved. People are so generous and so committed, but so few people ask and actually follow through. So as I think about resources, I just think everyone that you currently know is your best resource. It's not about something outside of your current world. So
is finding the right people to help you really important in this process?
Oh, it's critical. It's finding the right people, and it's finding a lot of the wrong people along the way as well. It's rubbing up against the world and talking to people and engaging them and figuring out by your interactions with them, what are you actually trying to do? Because they're going to ask you all kinds of questions you don't have answers to. And it's trying different things. It's seeing always like how can you engage people as volunteers before you have to raise the resources to do something with cash. It's so critical. And it's one of the things that donors I found and foundations look for in early stage entrepreneurs is how big of a network of people have you gotten involved in supporting you? And if you've basically been doing it on your own, haven't been able to get other human beings to donate their time, then it's probably a sign that you're not onto the right thing or you're not the right leader.
Apart from not everyone being really designed to be an entrepreneur and to not knowing what they've got themselves in for when they start something, do you think that or can you suggest anything that you think founders might not be aware of before they start up an organization, to do with the challenges or just how much time is involved? It sounds like it's quite a lot.
It's like it's infinite. Yeah, the piece of advice I give to serious sort of early stage social entrepreneurs, I think one is usually whatever it is you think you're going to be doing when you start is not the thing that actually matters, and is the right thing. And just go into it with a vision, but a lot of flexibility about the how. I think that's the first one. I think the second one is we tend to focus a lot as entrepreneurs on solving a problem, when in reality, what's usually a better model is figuring out what's possible and then inspiring others to come together to solve a problem. At Taproot, I really honestly believed when I started that we would be able to scale Taproot to serve every NFP in the United States, and build this massive marketplace ourselves. And realized after a few years, when we became the largest nonprofit consulting firm in the country, that that was a fool's errand, and that even if we became 10 times bigger, we wouldn't be even close to big enough. And if we became 100 times bigger, that wouldn't be big enough. And you realize like there's a limitation to how much as a nonprofit you can usually scale on your own, that the key is to do just enough to inspire everyone else to join you. And that's the only way you really achieve scale. So I just really push entrepreneurs to not think about it from the standpoint of how can I scale to solve this problem, but instead, what is it I need to prove or inspire people to do that's going to be enough to get them motivated to act?
What else would you say other than the capacity to scale is something that would help an organization stand out and be successful in the NFP space?
It really depends on the model and the person, et cetera. I mean, the thing that I found was often NFPs aren't willing to position themselves against each other. And I think one of the things that's really needed is disruption and being able to clearly stand out and say, well, all this is good intentioned. Here is why I believe this is a better way of doing things and why this old model doesn't work. And being willing to directly confront that. I think often the NFP is the sector's too polite. So I think that's one key piece. I think the other one is to really differentiate yourself as being more professional in the sense of really having strong marketing materials and having data and really being able to represent yourself like you'd want to see an organization you'd want to invest money in. Don't see yourself as a charity. Position yourself as an incredible social impact investment. I think is the other sort of main advice.
I think funding is something that's really, and you mentioned it yourself, so important for NFPs and so always playing on their mind because it's difficult to get right. What do you think the kind of the future is for how NFPs and social enterprises will kind of tackle this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a trend happening in the U.S., but more broadly, where government is playing less and less of a role in safety nets, and that they're relying more on citizens and organizations to fill that gap. And that has like a real impact on the whole issue of financing and funding for organizations, because they're being asked to do play a much bigger role, but the resources aren't often there. And what we're seeing in the U.S. and we're seeing in other countries as well is just a real move towards having the majority of your programs be fee for service, where you're actually getting paid by the recipients in some way, or you're getting paid by people who benefit or invested in the recipients.
Yeah, that's definitely happening in Australia as well, because a lot of our organisations were typically in the past funded by government, and they're kind of moving out of that.
Yeah, no, and it's so I think really pushing towards, pay for service. And I think the question becomes, and this is the question I asked when I started Imperative, was, are we going to primarily rely on charitable donations? And if the answer is no, then I'm not sure you want to be a nonprofit. And, I think different tax laws in different countries, so I don't know in Australia the specifics, but there are so many hurdles and challenges to running a non-for-profit that you don't have as a company. So I see becoming a non-for-profit as sort of a necessary evil if you have to do it, but that your default should always be to be a company, because it's much easier and there's more access to capital and there's more access to talent. And your mission can be the same, but changing your being for-profit as a tax status has a lot of benefits.
So I might move on to asking you a little bit about your board experience. You mentioned at the top there that you've had some board experience. Could you tell me, I guess, what a different kind of perspective, if there was a different perspective that it gave you on how organizations are run?
I don't know that it changed. I think it created a lot more empathy. I mean, having my own board at Taproot and then doing work with Board Source and then just doing work with boards in different capacities through Taproot, it really helped me understand why, at least in the US, boards are often the number one cited reason why executive directors or heads of NFPs quit. I think it's an incredibly hard structure to enable a entrepreneurial non-for-profit leader to operate under, because they don't have a clear single sort of manager, if you will, and at the same time they also have this board that's often got a combination of strategy, governance, and fundraising responsibility. That's just such an incredibly convoluted role that it leaves a lot of EDs like a pretzel, completely like confused and bewildered and frustrated. And it leaves a lot of board members incredibly disengaged and frustrated as well. It's rare to find a board member, I find, that says that they're well engaged by their organization. They all feel underutilized, nearly all of them. So, I mean, I think my overall insight is I think the board structure itself is broken, at least in the U.S. We've got to find a way to separate out these different functions to be able to provide much more clarity and to remove the conflicts of interest that happen when you've got people on the board who you're asking to give money and also asking them to govern. But I mean, I'll be curious to hear from you, like, to what degree is fundraising a core responsibility of most boards in Australia?
It's a lot less, I believe. Yeah.
That's good.
There's definitely not a serious or written down or perhaps even spoken rule that you should be involved in fundraising or personally give money to be on a board. I think it is probably connected back to the fact that traditionally and still it's very much still the case, a lot of nonprofit organizations get their funding from government and less so from fundraising or philanthropy. And even when they do, it's not an obligation, as I understand it, to personally give.
No, which I think it's great to have individual. Like, I think individual donors are really important for nonprofits, but the intersection with the board is really problematic. The other piece is, as I look at it, is really is board size is another thing that I really spend a lot of time looking at, and I think a lot of nonprofit boards in the U.S. at least are way too big, and I think that's a manifestation of, if your board is your primary fundraising vehicle, you tend to want it to be big. And as a result, you don't end up with good governance because you spend most of your time herding cats instead of actually like engaging in a strategic conversation. So I think that was a big part. I think the other piece, I think working with boards helped me appreciate was sort of the checks and balances where you need a board that slows your process down some. I mean, much like the U.S. structures its government, where you've got an executive branch and a legislative branch, you need an executive who's hard charging and executes, but at the same time, you need some kind of governing body that's able to really deliberate and make sure that you're moving forward deliberately and effectively. And I think a lot of that, for people who aren't engaged in that dynamic, don't see that tension that's there. That's healthy. It's frustrating as hell, but it's very healthy.
Aside from completely overthrowing the current system of governance, what could someone who's on a board already or thinking of joining a board but has these concerns, do you have any suggestions for what they could do to improve governance?
Well, I think one is just start a lot with empathy for the CEO or the executive director who runs the organization, really taking your cues from them as to what do you actually need. Not what should you do, but what do you actually need? And I think really engaging in that conversation, whether it's in looking at a board or actually currently sitting on a board, the head of an organization serves at the will of the board, but I think the board has to serve the head of the organization as well. So just really building a lot of empathy and listening skills there, I think, is huge. I think the other one is just real clarity on roles. And being really clear on what your role is, what's expected of you, and what you expect back is a really important process to go through. I think the third is to really, I advocate as an entrepreneur to be a voice for taking a risk. I think a lot of boards become really risk averse, and just being able to be on a board and saying what ultimately is at stake here, and do we want to take risks that enable us to have the chance to make a bigger impact, or is it more about having a stable sort of a stable mission and a stable delivery, and really being able to raise that question regularly I found to be really important. The other piece I would share is I spent a lot of time studying what generates meaning and purpose for people in their work, and that's the basis for our current services on imperative.com, which is helping you determine what generates purpose for you as an individual. And I would really encourage people who are looking to join boards or looking to take a role at a nonprofit or in general in their lives to take that assessment. It's free, it takes 10 minutes. It really helps you clarify what you're going to need and what you're going to bring to the table. So as a board member, it'll really help you think about, is this the right kind of non-for-profit for me? Does it have the right kind of focus? Can I engage in a way that's going to be meaningful to me? Because just because you're on a non-for-profit board doesn't mean you're going to get any meaning out of it if it's not aligned with who you are.
Once you have that worked out, and once you've, I guess, made an assessment of what the other dynamics of work on your board are, what would you suggest that you do or your organization do to find, I guess, the ideal board?
I mean, the ideal board is only relative to what you're trying to accomplish. So it's hard to answer in the abstract. I think the ideal board to me is probably 6 or 7 people who are deeply and strategically integrated in the mission of the organization and who are able to constantly be a sounding board, if you will, for the leadership of the organization and push and ask questions and help bring out the best in that person and their team. That to me is when a board is most effective. I think the secondary piece is much more the sort of risk management governance, which is just ensuring, baseline fiduciary responsibilities. But those are really just those to me, although they're not practiced enough, are the baseline. If you're not actually being generative and you're not playing that kind of partnership role with your leadership, you're probably taking more value than you're giving.
Do you feel like you're missing out on some of these aspects by having an organization that is a social enterprise or the more business model that wouldn't have a board? Can you find the strategic involvement, and can you find that elsewhere?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a board. We have to have a board as well as a corporation, and we have to look after our investors. So we've got a board. It's just very small. It's tightly focused, and it's less around the process and more around getting the work done.
Mm-hmm. Would you say it was very different from what you typically think of as an NFP board?
It's radically different in that I feel like my experience with NFPs, there's a strong sense of what a board should do. And a lot of it's window dressing and the dance based on the best practices. Whereas there's a much higher level of pragmatism. And also one of the key differences is that as CEO, I'm also chair of the board, which is much more common in a for-profit environment. Whereas in nonprofits, you have that division where typically the chair is not the CEO as well. And that also just radically decreases the amount of time you need to spend on the board because you don't have these two sort of different people. I think, as you get bigger, it's debatable whether or not that's a good model, but as an entrepreneur in the first 5 to 10 years, it's really healthy to have, I think, CEO also be the board chair.
So my final line of questioning today was just going to be about the role of leadership in nonprofits and social enterprise. How important do you think that is, and what role do you think it plays in the success of an organization?
Oh, it's everything. I mean, leadership is what makes people come to the organization. It's what makes people stay in the organization. It's what makes people, do their best work. It's what, gives us the courage to ask tough questions and have the humility to realize that there's always more to do. There's always more that can be done. Leadership is so vital. I think it has to be balanced with management, which is, the ability to really build some level of predictability within an organization and stability. But leadership is, it's everything.
You mentioned earlier that inspiring people you're working with is important. How do you go about inspiring the other people in your organization?
Yeah, and I'm not always successful at it, but I think the key in my mind is a couple of things. I think one is to always have long-term goals that are bigger than you can ever accomplish, but find ways to have short-term goals that you can accomplish so you constantly feel that sense of progress. Would be one. I think I think another one is really meeting people where they are. And again, a lot of the research behind Imperative's purpose assessment tool on our site is recognizing that people get inspired by different things. So you might get really inspired by stories about how we're going to impact individuals' lives. But for someone like me, that's not that inspiring. I want to hear how we're impacting organizations. And for other people, they need to hear how we're going to change society. And it's really easy to if you're someone who's motivated largely by societal change, to always project that and assume everyone else is, when in reality they're not. And to really become more self-aware about what you're projecting, as well as understanding where someone else is motivated so that you can basically meet them where they are instead of forcing them to try to come to where you are.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask just before we finish up is what you would recommend for aspiring leaders as kind of first stepping off point for getting involved in the sector at whatever kind of level they're thinking of doing that. What would you do to get started?
Yeah, I guess I would start off with a question sort of one step behind that, which is, sure, what is the change you want to see in your community or in the world? And it doesn't have to be the one, but just see like things that you notice as you walk around your community that you just think could be done better. And think of what the best way is to sort of contribute to that. It could be a nonprofit. It could be that you just do something as a citizen. It could be through a company. There's so many different ways to solve for it, but to think more in terms of the change you want to see in the world versus the sector you want to join, I think would be the first thing. I think the second would be to really be clear about what matters to you in terms of purpose. There's three things that generate purpose. It's relationships, it's impact, and it's growth. And to really evaluate every opportunity and not be sort of, don't assess it based on what the cause is or what the mission of the organization is as much as, will you be able to develop meaningful relationships? Will you be able to do work that's meaningful? And will you be able to grow personally? And if something clearly has all three, you're in the right place.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us on Sproutcast today, Aaron.
It's a pleasure. I'm really excited to be out in your neck of the woods this summer and to get to know a lot of you and hopefully be part of your community.
Wonderful. Well, actually, we'll be winter here, but we're in Brisbane, so hopefully it's going to be warm. But as Aaron just mentioned, he'll be a keynote speaker at the upcoming Better Boards Conference 2015. He's going to be presenting on the purpose economy, which, as I mentioned earlier, is also the title of his book. And I think it's your first time visiting Australia. Is that correct?
It is. I'm really excited.
Wonderful. Well, we're very glad to have you. Tickets for the conference are still available. You can register online via the Betterboard website, which is betterboards.net. Is there anywhere else where people can find you to learn more or get in touch? Aaron, you mentioned your website.
Feel free to email me anytime, aaron@imperative.com. Imperative.com is our main website, and we also have a website for the book, The Purpose Economy, which is easy to find. And I'm very active on Twitter and on LinkedIn, so if anyone's part of those networks, love to connect there.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Aaron.
Oh, my pleasure.
Did you enjoy this episode of Sproutcast? Visit sproutcast.net to sign up for our newsletter. The newsletter includes copies of the show notes and additional content from each episode.